Hello, and thank you to everyone here for staying until the last talk. I know it's been a busy few days of conferences, talks, meetups, and lots of information. I know that you're all probably a bit tired, maybe a bit brain saturated. So I just want to like a big round of applause to everyone for being out here and being a part of JSCamp. And as mentioned before, I'm here to talk about creating beautiful data-driven interfaces using Vue. And really, they're beautiful, they're sparkly, and I like them quite a lot. So what I'll be talking about over the next half hour is first, I'm going to clarify what do I actually mean by a dynamic data-driven UI. Because all of our applications kind of like talk with APIs and consume data anyways. So you might be wondering, well, are my apps already kind of data-driven? So I want to kind of clarify what I mean about that. After that, in Vue, there is a special component called component that is kind of the dynamic building block that enables a lot of power and flexibility. I'll be going over a bit of the basic use, how props and events work in Vue, especially within context of the dynamic components. And finally, once kind of all of these like building blocks and basics have been built up together, seeing what types of problems that we can solve with them by going through a kind of basic dynamic form. So first, what I mean by a data-driven UI is there's cases where you don't know what, say, the component's layout is in your application until it is actually up and running. Because for many screens, when we're building them and laying them out, we kind of know that we have to have like a card here, a button here, and so on. And we can kind of do that at, say, design time. However, there are a number of use cases where you don't know what types of components have to be displayed until the application is up and running and based on runtime data. So some of the kind of scenarios where this could happen is if you're talking with an API, maybe like a quiz engine or a form builder, and the server is giving you back a bunch of information, including, say, the types of components to display. Perhaps there's information in your application state that you want to, say, transform and project in different ways. Or you have an application where there is some way to kind of do a data-driven configuration. If you've ever had a requirement in an application where somebody says, oh, could you just add like 2 more fields to a screen? And then you kind of scream like, oh, that's so much work to go and just add 2 fields, do the testing, deployment, and so on. And it would be really nice if you could kind of maybe talk with an API, get the information to do that. So when would you need this? And kind of when I was like preparing for this talk in a blog post I did a while ago, there's only one other thing out there, a blog post out there that kind of said, dynamic components are not a requirement. And it's a blog post that I disagree with, or I sort of disagree with. Because it's not going to be too often that you're going to have, I want a dynamic component stated as an actual requirement. But it can be an elegant solution for a number of problems. For example, if you're doing any kind of, say, interface for a workflow builder, where the user is able to kind of maybe design a workflow on the screen, and also needing to visualize that. Or if you want to do, say, personalization within your website, either through kind of user-driven configuration, like adding widgets and controls to a dashboard, or as we're going into, say, machine learning and that, where you might have a recommendation engine that is trying to kind of predict the best layout for the application. And these are times where the kind of design time control of the layout might not always be in our control. Or if you're at a company that loves to do A/B testing, and you might have a third-party service, like, say, Optimizely, that says this user is in this group, and you want to load these types of components. And then any kind of, say, data-driven customization. And I've run into this situation a lot, where if you have kind of like a white label product or a software service where that like 90% of the stock application fits what a client needs, but then there's maybe like 2 or 3 fields that they want, or they just want to shift the layout slightly, and then you end up maybe just going and like copy-paste screen client B, and that's just never a good way of approaching things. And I think one of the most common use cases that I probably run into more times than I care to admit in my 10 or so years of web development is needing to dynamically generate a form, either through a form builder or if I've been working on a few applications for finance and banking and insurance, where there's all these like dynamic rules that state what questions can or can't be asked depending on like where your insurance policy is, what state it's in, and the laws per state. And the server is kind of telling you, well, in this case, we want to ask these questions. And trying to handle that can be kind of difficult depending on your tools. And personally, I think there are many more use cases for like this data-driven and dynamic approach. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you can kind of see how easy it is to use dynamic components in Vue and maybe get inspired to see where else that this could be useful. And kind of the general idea is that you have data or state in your application. You want to transform it in some way, and then dynamically build a UI out of it. So basically, we want to take something like this, kind of like a JSON schema, and then transform it into a functioning UI. And the thing is the schema could be a response to an API, could be through user interaction, might be dynamically formed up by like combining RxJS streams in weird and complex ways. And in the end, we still need to try and have an interface that we can interact with. So the basics of this is kind of the component or the special component within Vue. And I know that there's been a Vue workshop, and there was the talk yesterday based on Vue routing. So hopefully I don't have to go too much into the details of how a component works within Vue. If you have any questions about that, feel free to talk to me after the talk. But basically, in Vue, there is a special component for working with dynamic components. And if you go to the docs and give them a read, this is about as much as they have to say, is that you have a component, an is attribute, that loads a component with it. And that's all that you need to know about dynamic components. And if I was giving a lightning talk, I would be done about now. But however, if this is so easy, you might be wondering, why am I so excited about dynamic components in Vue? And the reason is they're so easy, it's almost boring. If using Vue is your first introduction to using a front-end framework, this just kind of seems like the way you would expect things to work anyways. However, I have had many years of experience with Angular 1, Angular 2, React, and if I had not felt the pain points of trying to do dynamic components in Angular, I don't think I'd be quite as excited as I am right now. If you're to do, like, Angular is a great framework. It has a lot of power and flexibility. It also really wants to, like, statically know what your application is. If you're to do a search of, like, Angular dynamic components, the official Angular docs kind of introduces a billion concepts that you have to kind of get your head around, where Vue, they work just how you'd expect them to. And the result of this is that you can start spending your time and effort actually building solutions that leverage dynamic components, not trying to get your head around, how do I even load a component dynamically? So the building blocks here is basically there is this meta tag. Like Vue has very few components and directives built in, but one of the ones that it does have is a component fiddly called component. And this is just a placeholder that will render out whatever component that you've passed into the is attribute. And one of the nice things about this is that it is only a placeholder, and it does not introduce any extra DOM or markup kind of in between the component tag and the element that it's rendering. And the nice thing about this is if you're ever trying to create a layout that's using, say, Flexbox, and if you have an extra host element introduced, that can, say, break the relationship between like the parent-child. Your layout goes wonky. This also works really great if you're trying to use SVG and kind of compose a number of components to make a SVG image, because you don't have to worry about any extra tags appearing in your markup that might give you a problem. However, kind of the secret sauce that really makes dynamic components powerful is the is attribute. And if you haven't used Vue before, the colon is kind of a short way of saying, I want to bind the is attribute to a property within my component. And the is attribute could be bound to either a property that you've passed into a component, a value on the data property, or on a computed property in Vue. And if you haven't had a chance to kind of get yourself familiar with Vue yet, Vue has a concept of computed properties that will kind of reactively update based on what's going on in your application. And there's kind of quite a bit of power that comes with that. And I think one of the really kind of cool things with this is if you're using, say, Vuex for managing the state in your application, you can kind of do all sorts of cool transformations on your Vuex state to try and kind of maybe project to a different type of component. And in this example here, I have two basic components, and this is showing how to, say, pass down the component that you want to load as a prop. On the one side here, we have the parent one that is just like wrapping a child component called like isProp that is bound to the active view. And on the other side, all we're doing is taking that active view prop and passing it along to the is attribute there. And instead of like jumping over to a browser and being all clunky, I've recorded a few animated GIFs to show a bit of this functionality. I will share out a link to a live demo in the repo later on. But you can kind of see here, as the contact details is being updated, it's updating the prop in the isProp component, and things are swapping back and forth. The other feature that you do is binding it to a computed property. And in this case, there is a flag called isContact. I can toggle that between true and false. And then the computed property, what Vue does is it sees in your computed properties what every other property that it depends on. And if one of those things changes, it will reevaluate that active view. So as you're kind of switching between setting the isContact to true or false, the component that is being loaded in its place is being updated. And kind of on that side of the screen, that is the Vue DevTools for Chrome. If you haven't had a chance to check them out, please do. They're awesome. It's probably one of the dev tools that I actually use quite a bit, and it's very handy. And you can even see when I'm changing the values in the dev tools, the application is responding in kind. And this is just going over a few of the ways that you kind of programmatically declare what components that you want to load in place. So components, however, don't live in isolation. They need to communicate with the world around them. And Vue, like React and Angular, is now a component-centric framework. They have the, if you're used to using Angular, you have your inputs and outputs. If you're using React, there's props and callbacks for emitting events. And Vue has the same idea with props for properties that you pass in, and emitting events to kind of to communicate with the parent. And Basically, props can be bound to a dynamic component just like you can with any other component in Vue. And one of the points that I kind of do want to get across here is that the dynamic component works just as you'd expect any other component to work. You don't need to learn a bunch of extra concepts or APIs and things just to kind of be able to load and work with a component dynamically. And so now I've gone from two separate components to using a component with the is attribute, and I found all of these extra properties. And a very nice thing with Vue is that it really does kind of say embrace the dynamic nature of the web in JavaScript, and it's not going to complain. Let's say when this is switching to the contact component, it's not going to be complaining about all the extra properties from address. It won't complain during build time. It won't complain during runtime. It won't say, hey, on component address, I don't know what the street1 attribute is, so I'm now going to crash. Vue handles this in a very nice way. However, as I was going through and experimenting with this, I then kind of thought, well, that's a whole bunch of information I need to kind of know up front on the kind of consumer side. And if we're having all these dynamic components, we don't know what props they're always going to expect. If we're getting information back from an API, there could be a potentially infinite number of variations of data that we need. And if I had to account for every single one in the template here, I would not be here talking about this topic right now, because I'd be like, ugh, not worth it. So do we need to know all of, say, the properties up front that our dynamic components might be using? And thankfully, the answer is no. In Vue, there is a feature called vbind, where if you pass in an object to it, any properties in the object that match properties on, the props on the component that you're loading will be passed down as props. So before, that is the example I had with every single property listed out. And you can see that it is binding all to kind of the contact object. If you use vbind, though, with the vbind, you just do vbind contacts, and any property in that context object that matches the component is loaded will be available and bound as a prop. So this makes it really nice because if your component requires more props or your data has more values, the number of areas that you have to touch and refactor to kind of make things work is really quite minimal. So the next question I had when I was experimenting with this is, well, what happens to all of those extra properties? Do they just go into the void and have no use? And Vue has a few ways of handling this. And regardless of which way that you're doing it, is all those extra properties will be available in the components instance on the attributes object, or $ATTRs for short. The default behavior in a Vue component is to basically have all of those attributes pass through and be applied to the root of the component that is being loaded. However, if you change the flag to false, you get more control over how they're bound and where they are bound. And to kind of go over what this looks like with the default behavior, I have the contact object on the side. My password is I want my money. I use it everywhere. Feel free to try and hack me later on. And you can see on the other side where I have the component, all of the properties that it does not know about are just attached to the root of the root node of the component that was loaded. And sometimes this is the behavior that you want. Sometimes you might want to have a bit more control. So if you change the inherent attributes flag to false, you can control where they are being bound to. So in this case, on the input, I have vbind, and all of the unknown attributes are now just kind of applied to the input tag. And let's say you wanted to, if the object had fields like min length, max length, required, disabled, and so on, in this reusable component, you don't need to declare every single possible attribute from like the HTML input that you could possibly use and duplicate that logic, you can just vbind, and if they happen to match up, they will work. And this feature also becomes very handy if you're like working with other libraries or wanting to wrap other components. And the demo application I was building out, I've been using a library called Vuetiful just because, and it's a wrapper around the Bulma CSS library. And one of the components that I was wanting to build, I didn't feel like trying to recreate the entire spec of their V drop-down component within my wrapper. So I was able just to kind of say, hey, vbind, all those extra attributes, and things kind of work as you would expect. In this, so now I'm going to move on to events. And events, again, work just like binding events to any other component that you are creating. You can have your DOM handler events like click, focus, blur, and so on. And you can also bind to any custom events that your component might be raising. And the point that I want to like try and clarify here is basically, if you're working with dynamic components in Vue, you don't have to have a whole new mental model to work with them, like you might have to say trying to dynamically load components within Angular where there is a bunch of extra stuff that you have to try and do. So now that I've kind of gone over some of the basics of components and dynamic components, I'm going to go over kind of my approach to building kind of a basic dynamic form builder. And what I found kind of interesting when I was doing this is I've been doing Angular for years. I was an early adopter of Angular 1, early adopter of Angular 2. I accidentally co-wrote a book with my company on Angular for doing Angular training. And kind of the example I have here, I still don't quite know how I would build the same thing in Angular. I kind of know the 3 or 4 blog posts I'd have to read, the API I'd have to read, and a number of different concepts. But after I kind of got my head around Vue, which only took me a few hours, I'm like, what could I solve in Vue that is currently giving me a hard time in my current framework of choice? And I had a very basic form builder built within about 3 hours, where I still don't quite know how I would do it in Angular, even though I have far more experience working with Angular. This isn't to say that Angular is bad. It does many things amazingly. But if you want to have this really dynamic application, there's sometimes where Angular kind of fights against you. So the setup that I have here, and also please keep in mind this is not meant to be a production-ready form builder. There are a few existing libraries out there that will do this a lot better, and I'd encourage you to go through and read their source code. It's way simpler than I would expect them to be. But the setup is I have a JSON schema. I use a directive called v4 to go through a collection. And then I do a bit of work to make things play nice with a vmodel, so you can still have the two-way data binding within your application. The schema is very basic, although I have probably I've had about dozens of projects over my career that have had an API at some form returning me data like this somehow. This isn't the most robust, but it's also not that far off from reality. And some of the components that I'm loading, and I'm not going to go through every single one in my form builder, but it's basically creating a label, an input, and passing down some values like placeholder, value, and so on. And what really then starts to drive the power behind this is using the v4 directive. I guess how many people here have used Angular 1 or Angular 2 and have an idea of what ng4 does? All right. Yeah, so basically, what v4 does or ng4 does is it looks for a value in your component, in this case schema, and it goes over the collection. It makes each item available within the template as the field property. And in the schema I had before, you saw that there was a field type property. So now I'm just binding it to component is field.field type. And the end result is, and the animation is purely for effect, it's not that slow in real life, is it loops over that and it starts to build a form based on that data. And if I was to be adding or removing items to that collection, this form will be updating in kind. And you might be wondering, well, what about like vif or ngif? And vif is still very useful, but it's still useful for kind of simpler use cases, where maybe if you had two components that you wanted to toggle between, vif might be a good case there. But an issue that you have is that you start to get really bloated templates if you start to get more than a few components. And then you start to repeat a lot of code to ensure that you're binding all of the correct properties and inputs and outputs. And I was going for an example of, like, if I was to rebuild my form builder completely using vif, I got about 3 components in before I got bored and tired of doing it this way. Because you can see that there's a lot of repetition between binding the value, the input, doing the if-else check, and as this kind of grows and grows and grows, it gets harder to maintain. It can get to be more error-prone, versus just being able to go through a v4 like this. Component it's a bit easier to read and understand, and this code can then be encapsulated into a reusable component itself. So you could have like a form generator component that everything else is consuming, so that each component that needs to be dynamic does not need to re-implement the same logic. So the next part is basically setting up data binding between the dynamic form, and because right now, forms that can't be populated with data or emit data back out to the parent live in isolation and are not, say, the most useful. And the way that Vue handles two-way data binding is with their vmodel directive. And you might be thinking, well, I thought the whole trend net was towards one-way data flow. What do you mean two-way data binding? And with Vue, it's kind of, say, two-way data binding within local component state. And vmodel is basically just a little bit of sugar on top of input value equals a value that you have, and then any time that a change happens, assigning the local value to the event target value. And so you kind of have two-way binding within the component itself, but you don't want to have, say, this mutating the consumer's data. So to create data binding with our custom form controls, we have 2 goals. One is to be able to pass a value to the child component, and then to also let the child component know that to let the child component know, inform the parent that a value has changed. And to do this, I would go and change the input component to now have a value property, and I would create a value as a prop on the component. And then emit a value saying that, hey, a value has changed. So now the consumer of this can use this component using ngModel as you'd expect, and you don't have to worry about accidentally mutating or modifying the parent. Because if I had just done ngModel value here, Vue would still appear to work, but if you open up the dev tools, you'd see it giving you a warning of, hey, you've accidentally mutated the parent value. And now in the form builder, to get to a binding between the, say, form data object and the generated data, I can now do, say, vmodel is form data, and then the key that was defined in the schema. And this is what lets us have the two-way data binding kind of between the form and the dynamically generated form and the application. I have a quick demo, although almost short on time. Let's go see if I can. I cannot seem to get near built-in retina display. I should have known to not and try and change from my setup. So I would have liked to have showed the demo application that I have. I can't figure out how to get Chrome onto the appropriate window right now. Let's see. I can connect mirror. Yeah, so as I can see that people are not wanting to watch me try and debug my inability to mirror displays properly. I have this kind of, so the demo I have, if you go to bit.ly/JSCamp BCN demo, I have a demo app up there that shows the various Thank you so much.
I think.
Yes. Yeah. So, apologies for that slight delay. So, in the kind of demo app I have, I'm also going to open up the DevTools on the side, and then open up the Vue DevTools. So this is a basic application that is building out a form based on a schema. And one of the things that I was playing around with is, could I generate a schema or a UI based off of the Vuex store or state, and could I do some changes with it? And if you have not had a chance to use Vuex before, it is very similar to Redux. And one of the things that I was wanting to show is I can add a new field, test data, hello, field type, text, maybe say a select list, hello, doing demos live. It's not always a good idea. And I'm going to add this field to the contact schema. And that data is now available there. And there's a few of these screens that I've hooked up to the store. So this form is also being generated from that. And there's also things that you can do, like, for example, if I wanted to change every text input in my schema to, say, a password input, I can go through and do that. Maybe not the best idea. Or let's say I want to go and on the addresses, and if I want to say prototype quickly, I'm like, I don't really like having this be a drop-down button. I want this to be a select list. Just by going through and modifying the underlying data, I can say, well, I want to find every drop-down in my schema and just change it to, say, a normal select list, go, and that now goes and updates. And I think this is kind of just scratching the surface of being able to use dynamic components in Vue. But if you've ever had an application where you've had a feature request like, oh, can I let an admin add a few fields to a screen? If you've ever had to build out a form builder or a quiz engine, this is kind of scratching the surface of being able to use dynamic components in Vue, and that they're so easy that I think for me it's opening up all sorts of ideas of how I can apply this. So on that note, the source code and slides are, well, the source code is currently available at bit.ly/JSCamp demo. And also, if you want a more of a tutorial style follow along on this that goes into a bit more details, I wrote a blog post on this fairly recently. And feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, GitHub, or talk to me after the conference. So thank you for your time. I had a great time, and hopefully you learned something new. Thank you.